They pitied her behind their painted fans. The whole of Mayfair agreed that Miss Verity Calder was being handed to a man who would never look at her, a man London had already tried and convicted in its drawing rooms. The rumors about the Earl of Ravenhurst were the cruelest kind, spoken in the language of raised eyebrows and unfinished sentences. He was unnatural, they said, not the marrying kind. A cold recluse who had buried himself in a stone house on the Yorkshire moors and would take a bride only to silence the questions being asked of him in the House of Lords. Verity expected a locked door and a lonely life. She had made her peace with a marriage of convenience, a husband who paid her bills and otherwise forgot she existed. Long corridors walked alone while the wind screamed off the moors. She braced herself for a lifetime of arrangement without warmth, of a title bought with her father's debts and her own quiet surrender. She did not expect the knock. On her first night at Ravenhurst Court, when the heavy oak door of her chamber had already clicked shut and the candle had burned low, a sound came from the connecting door. Soft, hesitant. And what the man London called a monster did next would shatter every rumor the city had ever sold about him and leave Verity Calder entirely undone. Because the coldest man in England was keeping a secret, and it was nothing the gossips had ever dreamed. The study smelled of stale gin, damp wool, and the particular sourness of a man who had run out of luck and had not yet run out of denial. Verity stood before her father's writing desk with her spine held rigidly straight. Her ribs ached against the stays her mother's maid had laced too tightly that morning, but she did not let the discomfort touch her face. She had learned young that to show weakness in this room was to bleed in a river full of pike. Sir Hugh Calder did not look up. He scratched his pen across a page, crossing out one more line of credit that no longer existed, as though the crossing out might undo the borrowing. He had been at the faro tables the night before. She could tell by the tremor in his hand and the yellow cast to the whites of his eyes. "Ravenhurst has agreed to the settlement," her father said at last, his voice a dry rasp. "Your debts, our debts, will be cleared by the end of the quarter. The papers are as good as signed." Verity looked at the thinning crown of her father's head rather than at his face. "Ravenhurst," she repeated. The name sat on her tongue like ash. "Yes." He finally raised his eyes to her, and they were bloodshot, the skin beneath them slack with the weight of years spent watching cards fall the wrong way. "You will marry him before the season ends." She did not cry. She had stopped crying over her father's gambling at the age of 14 when she understood that tears were a currency he did not value and could not spend. Romance, she had decided somewhere along the way, was a lie, sold in cheap novels to keep foolish girls agreeable. Marriage was commerce. She was a commodity. Her dowry was nothing at all, but she carried an old and respectable name, and a face that the world was pleased to call handsome, and between the two she was worth exactly enough to buy her family out of ruin. "I understand," she said evenly. Her father blinked as though her calm had knocked him slightly off balance. "You know the talk, I presume? The whispers." "I am aware of the rumors regarding the Earl's temperament," she answered. Sir Hugh waved a dismissive hand, and the pen left a wet comma of ink across his cuff. "Gossip. Nonsense dressed up to sell the society papers. But even if there is truth in it, girl, it works to your advantage. You will have his title, his fortune, his estates in the north. He will ask little enough of you. Provide an heir somehow, and you will be left to arrange your life as you please. It is a brilliant arrangement. A brilliant arrangement." He said it twice as men do when they are trying to convince themselves rather than their daughters. What Verity did not tell him, what she would tell no one, was that she had already read the settlement. 2 nights passed while her father snored with an empty decanter at his elbow. She had lifted the folded pages from his coat and read them by candle until the wax guttered. She had a head for figures that her father had in his own ruinous way trained, and in the dense clauses of that document she had found something that did not belong. A provision concerning the interests of a third party, a name that was not her father's and was not the Earl's. Deverell. She had folded the pages exactly as she found them and returned them to the coat and said nothing. But the name had lodged under her ribs like a splinter, and she had decided in that cold candlelit hour that she would marry the Earl of Ravenhurst. Not because she was resigned to it, but because it was the only door that led toward the truth of what had been done to her family. If she was to be sold, she would at least learn the terms of her own sale. She turned and walked out of the study. The door clicked shut behind her, and she leaned against the papered wall of the passage and closed her eyes for a moment. Only a moment before she made her face smooth again. Adrian Vaughan, Earl of Ravenhurst. He was 10 years her senior, notoriously withdrawn, the favorite subject of London's most vicious drawing rooms. He had passed the better part of his youth abroad in Rome, among dead languages and older stones, and had come home only 3 years ago when his elder brother broke his neck on a hunting field. Since taking the title he had done the minimum society demanded, and no more. He danced with no one. He courted no one. He kept the company of a small circle of bookish men, and the gossips had feasted on that fact with a ravenous, righteous delight. They said he despised women. They said he was unnatural. Verity did not much care. If it was true, it meant he would not force himself upon her in the drunken, fumbling way she had watched her father use her mother across the thin walls of too many rented houses. A distant, courteous stranger who paid her bills was more than she had ever dared hope for. She met him 3 days later at a stifling assembly in Mayfair, in the giddy heat of the coronation season, when the whole of London was still drunk on the sight of the young queen crowned in June, and every hostess was determined to outdo the last. The rooms were a crush of silk and sweat, and the heavy scent of hothouse flowers gone slightly rotten in the warmth. Verity stood near a potted fern with a glass of lukewarm lemonade waiting. "Hi's coming," her mother hissed, gripping her elbow hard enough to leave a mark. "Smile for the love of God. Look agreeable." Verity fixed a flat, practiced smile to her mouth and watched him come toward her through the crowd. Adrian Vaughan did not look like the delicate, fluttering creature the papers had drawn. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a severely cut coat of dark navy wool. He wore no jewels, no elaborate arrangement at his throat. His face was sharp and angular and deeply tired, and his dark hair, brushed back from a high forehead, was threaded early with silver at the temples. He stopped before them and bowed with an exactness that was almost cold. "Lady Calder," he said. "Miss Calder." His voice was a low baritone, rough at the edges, like an instrument left too long unplayed. "Your lordship," Verity answered, dipping into a curtsy that gave nothing away. "Would you care to walk?" he asked, and he did not look at her mother when he asked it. He looked at Verity, and only at Verity, with pale gray eyes that she thought were the exact color of winter ice on a stone trough. "I would be glad to," she said, and set her gloved hand on his forearm. Beneath the fine wool, his arm was solid and tense, the arm of a man braced against something. They walked away from her mother's glare, and the low buzzing of the crowd and the sea of aristocrats parted to watch them pass with an undisguised fascination that Verity felt on the back of her neck like a draft. The ruined man's daughter and the unnatural earl. What a pair, their faces said. What a delicious, ruinous pair. They reached the doors to the terrace, and he pushed them open, and the cool night air struck her face like a blessing. "I detest these gatherings," he said suddenly. He was not looking at her. He was staring out into the dark garden. "The feeling is entirely mutual, my lord," Verity replied. He glanced at her, and a small crease appeared between his brows. "You need not flatter me, Miss Calder. I am well aware of the shape of our arrangement. Your father was perfectly frank regarding the state of his affairs." "And what of your affairs, my lord?" she asked. She was tired, and she had no patience left for the small, careful games of drawing rooms. "Why marry me? Surely there are wealthier and more useful families who would gladly overlook a little gossip in exchange for the chance at a countess's coronet." He turned then and faced her fully, and the pale eyes moved over her face with a strange clinical attention, as though she were a page he was trying to read in poor light. "You do not chatter," he said. "You do not simper. And when you look at me, you do not look at me with fear, and you do not look at me with disgust. You look at me as though I am a piece of furniture you have not yet decided whether to keep. Is that what you want? She asked. Indifference. I want peace, he said, and his voice dropped low. I want the matchmaking mothers to cease parading their daughters at me like horses at a fair. I want the House of Lords to stop questioning my steadiness. I need a wife to manage my household and anchor my estate, and I need someone who will not expect a grand romance, because I have none in me to give. Then you are in luck, my lord, Verity said, and her voice was dry as chalk. I left my romantic delusions in the nursery. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. It was not a smile, but the hard line of his jaw eased a fraction. Then we understand one another, he said. Perfectly. The engagement lasted 3 weeks, and every day of it cost his solicitors a great deal of money. Verity was measured and pinned and draped in silks she had never been able to afford in her life, and the gossip followed her the whole while, like a bad smell no amount of new fabric could cover. She sat one afternoon in the parlor of Lady Aldous, balancing a cup of thin tea on her knee, while the other women circled her like carrion birds who could smell a wound. It is such a sudden match, the hostess purred, adjusting the lace at her wrist. We were all quite astonished. Ravenhurst is so very particular. I is a man of decisive action, Verity said, and sipped her bitter tea. Decisive, another woman tittered from behind her fan. Though one does wonder where his decisions tend to lead him. I'm told he keeps late hours at his club in the billiard room with a certain Mr. Frome. The implication hung in the air, heavy and crude. Verity felt a sudden flare of temper, not because they insulted the man she was to marry, but because of the smug, sheltered cruelty of them. They sat in houses paid for by men who kept women in Covent Garden and struck their wives behind closed doors, and yet felt themselves superior, because the Earl's supposed sins offended their delicate sensibilities. Sir Frome is a respected scholar of old charters and manuscripts, Verity said, and her voice dropped a register cold and flat. I believe his lordship shares an interest in the reading of ancient documents, but if you would rather imagine the two of them beneath the billiard table, madam, pray do not let me interrupt your fancies. The room went silent. The hostess flushed an unlovely mottled red. Verity set down her cup with a small, sharp click. Thank you for the tea, she said. I really must go. I have a fitting. She walked out with her chest tight, and she did not entirely know why she had defended him. Pride, she told herself. To defend him was to defend her own choice, even a choice that had been made for her. When she returned to the narrow rented house her family occupied, she found a parcel waiting. No flowers, no verse, a heavy flat package in brown paper. She opened it and found a set of bound volumes, treatises on the law of estates and the keeping of accounts, the sort of dense, useful books a steward might own and a lady was never meant to want. A note in a sharp, jagged hand was tucked inside the cover. It said only that she had mentioned on Tuesday that her father had sold her books and that a house ought not to be without them. Verity ran her fingers over the pressed lettering. Tuesday had been 4 days ago. They had sat in strained silence through his obligatory courting call, and she had made only a passing remark half to herself that she missed the smell of old paper. He had been looking out the window the whole time. She had not thought he was listening at all. A strange ache opened in her chest. She pressed it down at once. It was only a set of books, a wealthy man throwing a little money at a small problem. It meant nothing. Still, when he came the following evening to escort her to the theater, she thanked him, and she meant it. They sat in the shadowed box above the stage. The house was hot, and the whalebone of her evening gown dug viciously into her ribs. She shifted and tried to draw a full breath and could not, and she winced. "Are you unwell?" Adrian asked quietly without looking away from the players below. "I am perfectly well," Verity lied. He turned and looked at her, then his pale eyes moving over her rigid posture and the faint pallor of her face. "You are not breathing," he said. "It is the fashion not to breathe, my lord. It proves one is a lady." He did not laugh. He frowned, a deep scowl settling over his features. "It is barbaric," he said. "You look as though you were in pain." "It is nothing. It is not nothing if it hurts you." He shifted closer, and the scent of him reached her, sandalwood and clean linen and cold rain. He reached out and she stiffened, expecting his hand at her arm. Instead, his hand came to rest briefly against the rigid lacing at her back, light as a promise. "Tomorrow," he said so low the bustling crowd below could not possibly hear, "tell your dressmaker to let out the stays by 2 inches. If she refuses, tell her I will find another seamstress." "The gowns will not sit correctly," Verity said. "Society will call me slovenly." "Let them," Adrian replied, turning his gaze back to the stage. "I am already the unnatural Earl. They may as well call you the slovenly Countess. We shall be a scandal together, you and I." A short, startled sound escaped her before she could stop it. A laugh. It bubbled up from somewhere she had thought long since sealed. Adrian glanced at her, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward in a fleeting phantom smile that transformed his harsh face entirely and made him look for the space of a single breath devastatingly human. Then it was gone, tucked back behind the mask of a bored aristocrat. But Verity remembered it, and for the rest of that week, the whispers of society seemed a little less loud. The wedding morning dawned gray and cold and utterly unremarkable. There was no great cathedral and no hundreds of guests. Her father had insisted on a small private ceremony, calling it elegant, and Verity knew the truth of it, which was that he could not afford a wedding breakfast, and the Earl had no wish to make a spectacle of himself. She stood in the drafty stone vestry of a church in a fashionable square, shivering in white silk, while her mother fussed at her veil with trembling hands. "Now, Verity," her mother's began, her voice pitched high and thin. Tonight will be." She stopped and swallowed. "Well, you know the rumors. Perhaps nothing will happen at all. If he does not come to your room, you must not feel slighted. It is a blessing, really. Men are beasts. If he leaves you be, simply go to sleep." Verity looked at her mother's tired, lined face. "I know, Mama," she said. "I expect nothing." The ceremony passed in a blur of old words and echoing stone. Adrian stood beside her, a pillar of dark cloth, and he smelled faintly of brandy, whether from nerves or from courage, borrowed from a bottle, she could not tell. When he took her hand to slide the heavy gold band onto her finger, his skin was cold. His grip was firm, but he did not meet her eyes. They left the church and boarded at once the heavy traveling carriage that bore the Ravenhurst crest, and they turned north toward Ravenhurst Court, his ancestral seat in the North Riding of Yorkshire. It would be a journey of 4 days over bad roads. The door slammed, the horses lurched, and silence descended. Verity watched the cobbles of London give way to rutted country lanes. Rain began to spit against the glass, blurring the world into smears of gray and green. Hours passed. The quiet in the carriage was thick enough to lean against. "You are shivering," Adrian said, and the sound of his voice after so long a silence was almost a shock. "It is only the damp," Verity said. He did not argue. He lifted the edge of the heavy wool blanket, draped across his own knees, and held it out toward her. She hesitated. To share a blanket felt far too intimate for two people who had essentially purchased one another. But the cold was reaching into her bones, and so she slid across the leather seat, leaving a careful foot of space between them, and drew the wool over her legs. "Thank you," she murmured. "Ravenhurst is drafty," he said, staring at the brass handle of the door. "It was built for defense, not for comfort. The walls are thick, and the fires never quite reach the corners. You will want warmer clothes than those London silks." "I am adaptable, my lord." "Adrian," he corrected softly. "If we are to live in the same house for the rest of our lives, you had better use my name." "Adrian," she said, testing it. It sat heavy on her tongue. "Then you must call me Verity." He nodded once and leaned his head back against the cushions and closed his eyes. "The estate is isolated," he said. "There are no neighbors for 10 miles. The servants are quiet. It is a lonely place." "I am used to being alone," she said. He opened one eye and looked at her in the dim gray light. "To be lonely in a crowded room in London is a different thing than to be lonely in a stone house on the open moor," he said. "I will not keep you prisoner. If you wish to return to town for the season, you may. I will fund it." Verity looked down at her hands. He was offering her a way out of his life before she had even entered it fully. And it was a decent thing, a generous thing, and she could not for the life of her understand why it made her chest feel tight. "I have no desire to return to London," she said, and found that it was true. "I am quite finished with society." Adrian let out a long, slow breath. "Good," he said. "Society is a disease." They did not speak again for the rest of that day, but the silence between them had changed its texture. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It had become the companionable quiet of two people who had, without either of them quite noticing, begun to relax. They came to Ravenhurst Court on the fourth evening, just as the sun was going down behind the jagged edge of the moors. The house rose out of the earth like a natural cliff, dark and brooding stone, its narrow windows staring out over the desolate land like the empty eyes of something ancient and patient. It was intimidating. It was very nearly terrifying. Verity thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The servants were lined up in the great entrance hall exactly as he had described them, quiet and old and fiercely loyal, and they looked at her not with the disdain she had braced for, but with a cautious, hopeful sort of curiosity, as though she were a change in the weather they had been waiting a long time to see. "Show the Countess to her rooms," Adrian told a stern-faced woman he named as Mrs. Renshaw, the housekeeper. "Have a hot bath drawn. She is exhausted." He did not look at Verity. "I will be in my study. Good night, Verity." "Good night, Adrian." Her rooms were vast and rich, done in deep burgundy and heavy oak, and a fire already roared in the grate. A young maid named Nell unlaced her travel gown and freed her aching ribs at last, and she bathed in hot water scented with lavender, her mind gone entirely and blessedly blank. She put on a plain cotton nightgown, high at the throat and wholly without seduction, because it did not matter, because her mother had said it: if he leaves you be, simply go to sleep. She sat on the edge of the great four-poster bed. The house was silent, a heavy tomb, deep silence. She looked at the door that connected her suite to his. It was thick, dark wood, and it was closed. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. She was safe. She was alone. She was the Countess of Ravenhurst, and her life would be quiet and undisturbed and entirely her own. She drew back the covers. The knock came from the connecting door. Verity froze. It was not loud, but in the silence of that room it might as well have been thunder. She stared at the wood, her heart suddenly slamming against her ribs. "Verity," his voice came muffled through the heavy oak, low, hesitant. She stood her bare feet, finding the cold boards, and crossed slowly to the door with her pulse roaring in her ears. She turned the brass handle and the door swung inward with a faint metallic click. Adrian stood in the threshold. He had shed his coat and the cloth at his throat, and he wore only a white linen shirt open at the collar and dark trousers. A single candle in his hand threw long, flickering shadows across the harsh angles of his face. Stripped of his armor, he looked entirely different. He looked like a man, a very large, terribly quiet man. Verity clutched the collar of her nightgown. "May I come in?" he asked, and his voice was a low, rough scrape. She swallowed the dryness in her throat. "Yes." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him and set the candle on a table, and then he simply stood there with his hands driven deep into his pockets, looking at the floorboards between them, and not at her. "My mother told me," Verity began, and her voice came out too thin. She cleared it and tried again. "My mother told me that if you did not come to my room, I should simply go to sleep. She said it would be a blessing." His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the skin. "Your mother is a fool," he said. "But she was right to suppose you would rather a locked door. I did not lock it." He looked up. The pale gray of his eyes caught the firelight. "Why?" he asked. "Because you are my husband," Verity said, forcing the words out. "And because we made a bargain. My father's debts are paid. I am yours to use as you require to secure the line. I know what is expected of me." Adrian flinched. It was the smallest of movements, a sudden tightening of the shoulders, but she caught it. He took a step toward her. "Is that what you think this is?" he said. "A transaction? You think I came in here to use you?" Verity held her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to step back. "I think you are an earl, and earls require heirs," she said. "I am not a fool, Adrian. Do what you must. I will not fight you." The silence that followed was absolute. Then he let out a breath that sounded very like a curse, and he closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. She shut her eyes and braced for the rough hands, the tearing of cloth, the crude, fumbling weight she had been taught all her life to expect from men. Instead, she felt warmth against her face. She opened her eyes. He was standing inches from her, his hands hovering on either side of her jaw, not quite touching, and his chest rose and fell in harsh, uneven breaths. "Look at me," he whispered. She looked. "The rumors in London," he said, his voice dropping to a grating murmur. "They say I despise women. They say I'm cold and unnatural and empty of all feeling." He let his hands come to rest at last against her cheeks, and his palms were rough, calloused from the rains, but his touch was impossibly gentle. "They are half right," he said. "I am unnatural, because I look at the men of my circle, men like your father, who keep women in town and treat their wives as broodmares and take whatever they please by force, and I feel nothing but disgust." Verity's breath caught. "I let the rumor spread." Adrian confessed, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "It was the easiest way to keep the vultures off me. If they believed me unnatural, the matchmaking mothers stopped throwing their daughters in my path, and it gave me peace. But it was a lie. I do not despise women, Verity. I despise the women they tried to sell me, the greed, the falseness, the endless simpering." He leaned down until his forehead rested against hers. "And then I saw you standing in that corner, as though you wanted to burn the whole room to the ground." Her lips parted. A tiny gasp escaped her. "I am not going to use you," he whispered, and his mouth was so close his lips brushed hers with every word. "I'm not going to climb on top of you in the dark and take what I want and leave you weeping into your pillow. If I touch you, it will be because you ask. If I stay in this room, it will be because you want me here. And if you tell me to walk back through that door, I will go, and I will never cross the threshold again." He drew back just far enough to look into her eyes, and the coldness was entirely gone from his gaze. In its place was something raw and hungry and dangerously undefended. "The choice is yours, Verity. Tell me to leave." She stared at him. The man society called a monster. The man who had bought her. He was offering her the one thing she had been denied her whole life, which was the right to decide what became of her own body. The shock of it struck her like a blow, and the icy shell she had built around her heart cracked straight down the center. She did not speak because she did not know how. Instead, she reached up her trembling fingers, curling into the soft linen of his shirt, and she pulled him down. When his mouth covered hers, there was no brutality in it, only a desperate, shattering reverence. He kissed her like a starving man, like someone who had spent his whole life in the freezing dark and had at last found the sun. He did not hurry, and in the hours that followed, curled at his side, while the fire burned to embers and his heavy arm anchored her against him, Verity understood with sudden clarity why the rumor had been so necessary. A man capable of that kind of consuming tenderness could not survive in the shallow, vicious waters of London. He would be devoured. The coldness was his armor, and here in the dark of Ravenhurst Court, he had taken it off for her. She closed her eyes, and a single tear slipped down her cheek to soak into his chest, and it was not from sorrow. It was from the terrifying realization that she was already helplessly in love with her husband. And yet somewhere beneath the warmth of it, another thought turned over slowly, cold and quiet as a stone at the bottom of a well. When she had asked him why the good opinion of a world he despised should matter to him at all, he had not answered. He had told her the truth of the rumor, but he had not told her everything. There was a room in him still locked, and the name hidden in her father's settlement. Deverell waited on the other side of it like a draft under the door. The morning after the wedding, the household of Ravenhurst woke to a small earthquake. Mrs. Renshaw, keeping to the long tradition of aristocratic marriages, had instructed the maids to prepare 2 separate breakfast trays. The Earl would take his coffee in his study. The Countess would take her tea in her rooms. But when Nell knocked timidly at the Earl's door, there was no answer, and a ripple of quiet panic ran through the servants' hall. Had he gone in the night? Had the marriage already broken? Nell was sent to the Countess's suite. She knocked, and a deep voice within told her to come in, and she pushed the door open and stopped dead, the silver tray rattling in her hands. The Earl of Ravenhurst, the reclusive and terrible master of the house, was sitting up in the Countess's bed, bare to the waist, and beside him, tangled in the sheets with her head resting against his shoulder, was the new Countess. "We will take breakfast in the morning room," Nell Adrian said, as calmly as if he were remarking on the weather. "Set 2 places. And tell Mrs. Renshaw to have my things moved from the east wing. I will be residing in this suite from now on." Nell squeaked Bob to curtsy, so hasty she nearly upended the tray and fled. Verity laughed, sitting up and drawing the sheet across herself. "You have scandalized her," she said. Adrian turned his head and pressed his lips to her bare shoulder. "She will recover," he said. "I refuse to sleep across the house from my own wife like a polite stranger. Life is far too short for that particular misery." The news went through the stone corridors like fire through dry gorse. The Earl had claimed his wife. The rumors out of London were false. The servants who had spent years watching their master wander the halls like a hollow ghost moved now with a new and frantic energy. That afternoon, the rain broke at last, and the sky over the moors opened into a hard, piercing blue. Adrian ordered 2 horses saddled. "You can ride?" he asked as they stood together in the muddy courtyard. She wore a heavy riding habit of dark green wool, a plain and practical thing, worlds away from the flimsy silk of London. "My father sold my horse when I was 16 to cover a debt," Verity said evenly, drawing on her leather gloves, "but I have not forgotten how." His jaw tightened at the mention of her father, but he said nothing. He simply stepped forward, gripped her waist in his large hands, and lifted her onto the side saddle of a calm gray mare as though she weighed nothing at all. They rode out past the iron gates and left the shadow of the great house behind. To the sheltered people of London, the north was a wasteland, but Verity saw only an untamed and violent beauty, the hills carpeted in dying heather, the wind howling off the distant sea with the scent of salt and crushed peat. Adrian rode a little ahead on a massive black gelding, watching the land with the keen, possessive eye of a hawk, and here on the rough earth and the gray stone, he did not look tired or cold at all. He looked as though he belonged. They came to the crest of a high ridge, and below them in the valley a small village sat with smoke curling from its stone chimneys. Adrian drew rein. "Tenants," he said, nodding down at it. 200 families, sheep farmers mostly, and a few weavers. "They rely on you," Verity observed, watching a tiny distant figure drive a flock of white specks across a far field. "Yes." He kept his eyes on the valley. "My brother Lionel was meant to inherit all of this. The golden one, charming and beloved. He loved London, the politics, the parties. I was the spare content, to spend my life in a library in Rome among dead languages." It was the first time he had spoken of his brother. Verity held very still and did not dare break the fragile spell of it. "I broke his neck at a fence on a fox hunt," Adrian said, and the words came out flat. "Drunk." And suddenly the title was mine, and the debts he had hidden, and the tenants near to starving because he had bled the estate white. He turned to look at her, and the wind tore at his dark hair. "When I came back, they expected me to be Lionel, to throw balls, to smile, to play their games. I could not. I hated them for dancing while my people up here could not afford coal for the winter. So I stopped speaking to them and spent my hours with Frome and a few quiet men who cared for old things instead of new gossip. And society did what it does best. It invented a story to explain the thing it could not understand. The rumors," Verity said softly. "I let them believe I was a deviant because a deviant is ignored," he said. "A grieving, angry man is managed. I refuse to be managed." He reached out and laid his gloved hand over hers where it rested on the pommel. I hid behind the gossip Verity. It was cowardice. "It was survival," she corrected fiercely, and turned her hand beneath his and threaded her fingers through his own. "They are parasites. You starved them of the drama they craved. That is not cowardice. That is strategy." He stared at her, and slowly the rigid tension went out of his shoulders, and the phantom smile came back, and this time it reached his eyes, and it was a beautiful and devastating thing. "You," he murmured, his voice carrying over the wind, "are exactly the wife I needed." But even as she smiled back at him, Verity thought of the name in the settlement, and she thought of how neatly he had told her the whole truth of the rumor, and yet said nothing at all of a mortgage or a plantation or a man named Deverell, and the cold stone at the bottom of the well turned over once again. The weeks that followed settled Ravenhurst into a deep and steady rhythm, and Verity took to her new life with a vengeance. She commandeered the estate ledgers and sat for hours in Adrian's study while he worked across from her, and she discovered that her father's ruinous habits had, without either of them intending it, taught her a great deal about accounts and about the quiet ways a man might hide money he did not wish found. She found leaks. She straightened the crooked supply lines that had cheated the tenant farmers and funded the repair of 3 fallen cottages before the first snow. It was in those ledgers on a raw afternoon in early winter that she found it. The figures on the older pages were faint and crabbed, indistinct columns that would have meant nothing to a casual eye. But Verity read them the way another woman read a novel, and among the entries from her late brother-in-law's tenure, she found a debt so large it made her go still. A mortgage. An enormous one secured against something the estate did not seem to own outright. And against that entry, in a clerk's careful hand, a single name recurred like a stain that would not scrub out. Deverell. She sat back in her chair and looked across the study at her husband, who was frowning over a letter and did not know he was watched, and she thought, there it is. There is the locked room. She did not ask him. Not yet. She had learned in a house full of a gambler's secrets that a question asked too soon only teaches a man to guard his answer better. Instead, she went looking on her own, and it was in that season of quiet searching that Mr. Elias Frome came to Ravenhurst. He arrived on a bitter afternoon, looking as though he had been dragged behind the coach rather than carried inside it. A slight and narrow man whose spectacles slid constantly down his nose and whose hairline was in full retreat. When he stepped into the cavernous entrance hall, shaking a dripping umbrella, he let out a long and theatrical groan. "I have crossed into the underworld," Frome announced to the echoing stone. "Ravenhurst, if you have lured me to this frozen waste only to murder me and sink my body in a bog, I beg you do it quickly. I cannot endure another hour in damp wool." A deep, booming sound rolled down from the top of the stairs, and it took Verity a moment to understand that it was a laugh, loud and unguarded and entirely genuine. Adrian came down the steps 2 at a time and took his friend by the shoulders and clapped him on the back hard enough to make the smaller man stagger. "Frome, you survived the mud." Barely Frome wheezed, righting his spectacles. "And I was made to share a post-chaise at an inn with a man who smelled distinctly of pickled onions. It was harrowing. I demand brandy, a very great quantity of it." Then his eyes slid past Adrian and found Verity where she stood near the library doors, and he froze. The complaints vanished. He pulled off his wet gloves and made a stiff, awkward bow. "My lady," he said, "a profound honor. I apologize for the intrusion. I did write ahead, but the post north of the moors is largely a rumor." Verity stepped forward and studied him. This was the man the whole of London named the Earl's secret lover, the pivot on which all the vicious gossip turned, and he was clutching a leather satchel to his chest like a shield and trembling faintly with cold. He was not a threat. He was a brilliant and painfully shy scholar who was terrified of her. "Mr. Frome," she said, and made her voice warm and stripped it of every trace of aristocratic hauteur, "Adrian has told me a great deal of your work. I took the liberty of having a fire lit in the blue room, and Mrs. Renshaw has tea waiting and a very large decanter of brandy besides." Frome blinked behind his thick lenses. He looked at Adrian, then back at her, and the tension drained out of his narrow shoulders so fast he visibly sagged, and a great relieved smile broke across his face. "You are very kind, my lady," he said. "Very kind indeed." He stayed the better part of a week, and the house filled with the sound of two men in cheerful argument. They shut themselves in the study, and Verity, who ought by every rule to have withdrawn and left them to it, did no such thing. She sat with them, read her ledgers, and now and then corrected Frome's frankly atrocious arithmetic. There was no illicit romance and no hidden glances. Only the deep, easy affection of two men who had each found refuge in old and quiet things when the modern world proved too cruel to bear. But there was something else, and Verity, who had spent her life reading the small tales of men with things to hide, saw it plainly. When she came upon them unexpectedly, they went quiet in a particular way, and the papers Frome drew from his satchel were not the old estate maps he pretended. She caught once the crest of a government office stamped on a sheet before he folded it away. She said nothing, but she understood well before he left that whatever the two of them were doing together had nothing to do with maps and nothing to do with the vulgar thing London imagined, and everything to do with the name in her father's settlement. Frome went home the next morning, and 3 days after that, the first letter came from Deverell's solicitors. It was a courteous letter, in the way a knife laid on a table is courteous. It reminded the Earl with many soft, lawyerly phrases that a certain mortgage stood against the estate, that a certain sum would shortly fall due, and that the writer trusted his lordship's recent marriage had not distracted him from his obligations. And near the end, folded into a sentence about the uncertainty of the times, there was a small, poisonous observation. It noted that a marriage entered into with unusual haste and settled through the good offices of a mutual acquaintance sometimes proved to rest on ground less firm than the parties supposed. Verity read it over Adrian's shoulder, and she felt him go rigid beneath her hands. "What does he mean?" she asked. "Ground less firm." "Nothing," Adrian said, and folded the letter closed. "It is a threat with no teeth. Deverell likes to remind men that he holds their paper. It is his way." "Who is he?" Verity pressed. "Ah, creditor," Adrian said, and there was a wall in his voice she had not heard since the terrace in Mayfair. "A man my brother should never have dealt with." He rose and crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the white and freezing moor. "Let me manage it, Verity. I have managed it this long." "You have not managed it," she said quietly. "You have hidden from it." "I have read the ledgers, Adrian. I know the size of the debt. I know it is secured against something that is not in the estate's terrier, something that is not here at all." She took a breath. "I know his name was in my father's settlement before I ever set foot in this house." He turned. For a long moment he only looked at her, and there was fear in his face. Not fear of her, but fear of the thing itself, the locked room, the draught under the door. "You should not have found it," he said. "I find everything," she answered. "It is the only useful thing my father ever gave me." "Tell me, Adrian." "Whatever it is, I did not marry you to be kept in the dark like the rest of London." But he would not that night. He came to her, and he held her, and he pressed his mouth to her hair, and he said, "Not yet," and it was the first true distance that had opened between them since the connecting door had swung inward. It was not the distance of two people who did not love one another. It was the distance of a man standing between his wife and a fire he was ashamed to let her see. Winter closed its fist over the moors. The snow came and lay deep in the folds of the hills, and the roads to the south grew treacherous, and Deverell's letters kept coming one every fortnight, each a little colder than the last. And Verity, unable to sleep, took to the ledgers by candlelight, and she began slowly to teach herself the shape of the thing her husband would not name. She found the name of a place, Carrick Bay. It appeared nowhere in the accounts of the Yorkshire estate, but it was written into the terms of the mortgage as the thing pledged, and it was written into a handful of very old letters kept in a locked drawer of the late Lionel's desk. Letters she opened one bitter night with a hairpin and a steady hand. The ink on them was brown with age and half indistinct, but she read enough. Carrick Bay was a plantation. It lay across the sea in Jamaica, and it had been for 3 generations of the Vaughan family, worked by men and women held there as property. She sat back in the cold dark and felt something turn over in her that was not the old cynical calculation of debts and creditors, but something heavier. She had known the way everyone of her class knew and did not think about that a great deal of English money came from such places. She had not known that her husband's money was that money. And then she understood something else, hidden in plain sight all along. Ravenhurst was poor and cold and mortgaged to the hilt, and it need not have been. Because in the year that Parliament abolished slavery across the West Indies, the government had voted an immense sum, 20 millions of pounds, not to the men and women who had been enslaved, but to the people who had held them in compensation for the loss of their property. A family that had owned Carrick Bay would have had a great claim on that money, enough to lift Ravenhurst clean out of debt and keep every tenant in coal for a generation. So where was it? She found the answer in the last of the old letters, and it made her put her hand over her mouth in the dark. The claim on the compensation for Carrick Bay had not been paid. It was disputed. 2 parties claimed it. One was the estate itself, Adrian, as the owner of the plantation. The other was the man who held the mortgage, who argued that the money owed against the mortgaged property was rightly his. The other was Deverell, and Adrian, who could have ended the dispute at any time by pressing his own claim and taking the money, had not done it. Year after year, he had let the claim sit unresolved, let the estate go cold and poor, let Deverell circle closer rather than close his fingers around that particular sum. She did not yet understand why. But she understood at last the shape of the locked room, and that the shame her husband carried was not the small grubby shame London imagined, but something far larger and far older, and she loved him more fiercely for it, and she was afraid. She went to him the next morning while the snow fell soft against the windows of the study, and she laid the old letters on the desk between them, and she said his name, only his name, and waited. Adrian looked at the letters and then at her, and his face did a thing she had never seen it do. It crumpled briefly, the way a strong wall crumbles when the ground beneath it finally shifts, and then it steadied. "You found it," he said. "I found it," she answered. "Now tell me the rest. Tell me why you have let this ruin you rather than take what the law says is yours." He sat for a long time with his hands flat on the desk. Then he told her. He told her that when he had come home and understood fully, for the first time, where the family money came from, he had been unable to eat for 3 days. Lionel had mortgaged Carrick Bay to Deverell in the last reckless year of his life to cover a mountain of gambling debt, and when abolition came and the compensation was voted, the dead brother's creditor and the living brother's conscience had been left tangled together over a sum of money that Adrian could not bring himself to touch. "It is blood money, Verity," he said, and his voice shook. "Every shilling of it. They call it compensation, but they paid it to the men who did the wrong, not to the ones it was done to. If I take it, I take money earned out of the bodies of people my family owned. And if I do not, Deverell takes it instead. The estate falls to him, and every tenant in that valley pays for my conscience with a cold hearth. That is the choice I have failed to make for 3 years. I could not decide whether to be a hypocrite or a coward, and so I have been both." Verity looked at her husband, the man society called a monster, sick with a scruple that not one of the fine men in their glittering drawing rooms had ever once suffered from, and she reached across the desk and took his cold hands in hers. "Then we will find a third way," she said, "because I will be neither married to a coward nor kept by a hypocrite. There is always a third way, Adrian. It is only hidden in the paperwork, and I am very good at paperwork." She did not yet know what the third way was, but she had said it aloud, and in saying it, she had turned the whole weight of her sharp and stubborn mind toward the problem, and a woman like Verity, once turned toward a problem, was not easily turned away. She was still turning it over 3 days later when Deverell himself came to Ravenhurst. He came in a fine carriage through the snow, arriving without warning on a white and brilliant afternoon on the pretext of inspecting a property he claimed to have acquired somewhere in the north. It was a transparent lie. There were 3 inns between the main road and the house. He had come to see with his own eyes whether the marriage was real, and whether the new countess was the pitiable creature the London gossips had promised, and whether the time had come to close his hand. Sir Rowland Deverell brought the stale, suffocating air of London society into the parlor with him. He was a handsome man of middle years, well-made and well-dressed, but his eyes were sharp and cold and did not smile when his mouth did. Ravenhurst, he drawled and offered a bow that was a half-inch too shallow to be respectful. And the lovely countess, a picture of rustic domesticity. How charming. He looked about the ancient, dim-paneled room with open disdain. A trifle draughty, is it not, my lord? One hopes her ladyship is kept warm. Adrian had gone absolutely still. The easy man of the past weeks was gone, replaced in an instant by the cold and brooding Earl, and his fists were clenched at his sides, and Verity saw murder move behind his eyes. She stepped forward smoothly and placed a light restraining hand on his forearm and felt the violent tension humming beneath the wool and squeezed once. "Let me the pressure," said. "Sir Rowland," she said, and her voice dropped into the flat, icy register she used for unruly tenants and bad debts. "How fortunate that you found us. I hear the roads near your new property are treacherous, particularly for a man accustomed to the smooth pavements of St. James." Deverell smiled a thin, predatory stretch of the lips. "Indeed. One must suffer some discomfort to look after one's investments, though I see some of us prefer to keep our investments well away from the public eye." He let his gaze travel slowly around the room. "It must be a great strain on you, my lady, to be so isolated, so far from anyone who might come to your aid should the need arise." He paused delicately. "Your mother is quite frantic with worry, you know. Should you ever require a swift escort back to civilization, my own carriage is entirely at your disposal." It was, Verity understood, a beautifully constructed thing. In a single breath he had insulted her husband, reminded her of her family's leash, and offered himself as her rescuer, all under the perfect cover of gentlemanly concern. She did not flush. She did not raise her voice. She crossed unhurried to the sideboard and poured herself a glass of cordial, and with her back to him she said, "Tell me, Sir Rowland, I have been reading a great deal of late. Old financial columns, mortgage rolls, that sort of dull thing. I find I have a head for it. Tell me, is it true that the sum you claim against Carrick Bay is a good deal larger on your ledgers than the sum my late brother-in-law actually borrowed from you?" The room went very quiet. Deverell's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes went flat and watchful, the way a card player's eyes go flat when the wrong card is turned. "I do not take your meaning, madam," he said. "I think you do," Verity said, and turned to face him with the glass in her hand. "I think the figure you have written down and the figure you actually lent are two different figures. And I think that a man who inflates a claim is a man who does not expect his ledgers to be closely read." She took a step toward him, and Deverell, for all his composure, leaned back. "I have read them closely, Sir Rowland. I have copies. And numbers, unlike gossip, do not care whom they embarrass." For a moment the cold and handsome mask slipped, and beneath it Verity saw the thing he truly was, which was a man who had clawed his way up out of the trade and married money and bought a baronetcy and wanted more than he had ever wanted anything to be counted a gentleman, and who hated the old families for looking down at him, even as he sank his hooks into their debts. She saw him decide in that instant that she was dangerous. He recovered quickly. He always did. "This is very entertaining, my lady," he said, his voice gone soft and reasonable. "But I fear you have wandered into waters deeper than your reading has prepared you for. The claim on Carrick Bay is mine, and it will be settled before the commission upon the proper evidence." He gathered his hat and gloves. "Your husband could have resolved it years ago had he the stomach. He did not. My paper is good, and my claim is sound, and this cold house and everything in it will pass to me by the plain operation of the law." He bowed again, shallower still. "Good day, my lady. I shall look forward to reading your copies. In court." He turned and walked out. And a few minutes later the crunch of carriage wheels on frozen gravel came faintly through the walls and was gone. Silence descended on the parlor. Adrian let out a long, ragged breath and crossed the room and took her by the shoulders. "That was magnificent," he said, "and reckless, and I will not have you place yourself between that man and me again." "Told him," Verity said, though her own hands she noticed were not entirely steady. "He did not expect the numbers. Did you see his face when I named the figure? He has inflated the claim, I am certain of it now." She frowned. "But he is not wrong about the law, Adrian. If it goes before the commission on the paper as it stands, his mortgage is a solid claim and yours a reluctant one, and reluctant claims lose. Rattling him is not the same as beating him." "Then let it go before the commission," Adrian said grimly. "Let him take it. I have wanted to be rid of that money for 3 years. "And your tenants," Verity said. 200 families, Adrian. They do not have the luxury of your conscience. If Deverell takes the estate, he takes them too, and he is not a man who will keep their roofs sound out of love. No, we do not let it go. We win it cleanly and decide ourselves what becomes of that blood money, rather than leave it to a man who would spend it on a peerage." "But how?" he asked, and for the first time she heard something in his voice that was not despair, but the beginning of hope. "The paper is against us." Verity was already staring at the fire, not seeing it, seeing instead the crabbed columns of the old ledgers, the inflated figure, the crest of a government office. Frome had folded away too quickly the disputed claim that had sat unresolved for 3 long years. "The figure is inflated," she said slowly. "That is one thread, and there is another. A claim does not sit unresolved for 3 years by accident, Adrian. Deverell has not pressed it any more than you have. A man so eager to take this estate would have forced it to judgment long ago, unless there was some flaw in his own position he did not want examined too closely." She set down her glass. "Write to Frome. Ask him to come back and to bring everything he has ever pulled from the commission's records. I do not believe Sir Rowland Deverell is half so certain of his own paper as he pretends, and I intend to find out why." Frome came back through the thawing roads in the last week of February, laden with a battered trunk of copied records and the nervous excitement of a scholar let off his leash. When Verity told him plainly what she was looking for, that she believed Deverell's claim was rotten somewhere at its root, his eyes lit behind their thick lenses, and he rubbed his thin hands together and said, "Oh, my lady, now that is a document problem, and document problems are the one thing in this world I am not afraid of." They worked for a fortnight and turned the study into a paper mine. Verity brought her ledgers and Frome his copies, and Adrian, who could not read a mortgage roll to save his life, but knew his family's history better than anyone alive, sat with them through the long nights and answered their questions and watched his wife with a look of such open wonder that Frome, glancing up once, had to look away. It was Verity who found the first piece, and it was in the numbers as she had known it would be. She laid Deverell's stated claim beside the actual sum Lionel had borrowed, reconstructed from 3 separate entries in 3 separate years, and the difference was stark. He was claiming very nearly half again, as much as he had lent padded with interest, never agreed and charges never rendered, in the confident expectation that no one on the estate side had the wit or patience to reconstruct the true figure. It was fraud plainly once set out in 2 clean columns. But fraud alone, Frome cautioned, would take years to prove, and years was time Ravenhurst did not have. It was Frome who found the second piece, and it was the piece that mattered. He found it late on a bitter night, buried in the copied records of the commission, and he went so still and so quiet over it that Verity looked up from her own work and knew at once that something had happened. He read it 3 times. Then he took off his spectacles and cleaned them with great care on his sleeve, which was a thing he did, she had learned when he was trying not to appear as excited as he was. "My lady," he said, "do you know what a chose in action is?" "A thing you may sue for but cannot hold in your hand," Verity said. "A debt, a claim to money owed. I have read your books, Mr. Frome. The compensation owed for Carrick Bay is exactly that," Frome said. "A chose in action, a claim against the government for a sum of money, and such a claim may be assigned handed on from one party to another like a parcel passed along a line. When two parties both claim the same debt, each saying the parcel was passed to them, the question of who has the better right is not settled by who signed his paper first. He leaned forward, and his voice dropped. It is settled by who gave notice first. Whoever first sent word to the party holding the money, in this case, the commission itself, saying, "This debt is now assigned to me," that party takes priority. It is a rule laid down some 10 years past in a case the lawyers all know. First to give notice, first in right. Verity felt the whole shape of the thing rotate in her mind and lock into place, the way a key turns when it finally finds the right ward. "And Deverell," she said slowly. "When did Deverell give notice of his mortgage to the commission?" Frome smiled the shy, radiant smile of a man who has spent his life among documents, precisely so that one day he might hold up a single sheet of paper and change everything. "That is the beautiful part," he said. He gave notice late. He assumed, as men of his sort, assumed that being the creditor was enough and did not notify the commission until well after the compensation was voted. He turned a copied page toward her, its writing faint and official, and to a casual eye entirely indistinct. But Verity understood exactly what it was. Someone else gave notice first, he said. Nearly a year before him. A trust. The Carrick Bay compensation settled into a trust with notice duly given long before Deverell ever thought to protect himself. By the plain rule of first notice, the trust takes priority over the mortgage. His claim for all his bluster stands second and always has. That is why he never forced it to judgment. He knew that the moment anyone examined the order of notice, his position collapsed. Verity stared at the page. A trust, she repeated. Whose trust? Who assigned the compensation into a trust a year before Deverell woke up to protect himself? And then she looked up very slowly and turned toward her husband, who had gone white and quiet in his chair. And she understood the last thing, the thing that was not in any ledger, and her breath left her. You did, she said. It was you. Adrian did not answer for a long moment. Then he rose and went to the window, and with his back to them both in a low and unsteady voice, he told them the rest. I told them that, 2 years ago, unable to spend the blood money and unable to let it fall into Deverell's hands, he had quietly done the one thing that let him do neither. He had assigned the whole of the Carrick Bay compensation, every disputed shilling, into a trust. And the trust was not for him and not for Ravenhurst. He had spent those 2 years with Frome's patient help, tracing what could be traced of the people who had been enslaved at Carrick Bay, the men and women and their children freed at last when the apprenticeship ended their names, where they had gone, the free community they had begun to build across the sea. The trust was for them. Every penny of that money when it was finally released was to go to them, as near as one imperfect trust could come to restitution for a thing that could never truly be repaid. That is why I am poor, he said, still facing the window. That is why the fires do not reach the corners. I have carried this estate on nothing but rents and stubbornness for 2 years because I would not touch that money for myself and would not let it go to Deverell, and I could tell no living soul because the moment it was known, Deverell would have moved to break the trust before the notice could do its work. He turned at last, and his face was naked. I did not tell you, Verity, because I believed the kindest thing I could do for any woman I married was to keep her out of it. Verity crossed the room and stood in front of him. Behind her, Frome had very tactfully become interested in his own boots. You foolish, decent man, she said, and her voice was thick. You have sat in the cold for 2 years guarding a fortune you meant to give away, and let the whole of England call you a monster for it. She reached up and took his face in her hands the way he had once taken hers. You are the only honest man in a country full of thieves, and it has very nearly destroyed you. And you were not going to tell me. She shook her head, half laughing, half weeping. Well, it is fortunate then that I find everything. And then the practical part of her mind, which never rested long even in the middle of feeling, came back to the surface, and she stepped away and turned to Frome, who looked up hopefully. The notice was given first, she said. The trust takes priority. Deverell's mortgage stands second, and his claim is inflated besides. We have him. Not quite, Frome said, and the caution came back into his voice. On the order of notice, the trust prevails. That is true. But Deverell will not lie down. He knows the marriage was made in haste, and he has hinted more than once that he means to attack it. If he can persuade a court, the settlement itself was flawed. He muddies everything. And there is a further trouble. He spoke gently because he was a gentleman. Her ladyship is a married woman, and by the law as it stands, a wife cannot bring or defend a suit in her own name. Whatever her ladyship uncovers must be carried into the commission by the earl or a trustee or counsel. The law will not let her stand up and speak for herself. He looked genuinely pained. It is monstrous, and it is the law. Verity was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, and it was not a bitter smile. Then, let the law have its little rules, she said. I have spent my whole life speaking through other people's mouths and getting my way regardless. Let counsel stand up and read every word. I will only have written all the words first. She turned back to the papers spread across the desk. But before any of that, she said, there is one more thread to pull, and it runs through my father, and I think Sir Rowland has been careless with it. She had been thinking she told them about Deverell's threat that the marriage rested on unstable ground. A man did not make such a threat idly. The only thing Deverell could hold over the marriage was the settlement itself, arranged, she now understood, with his own involvement, the settlement in which she had found his name in the first place. If there was a defect in it that Deverell meant to spring at the last moment, then someone had helped him build it, and only one person on the estate side of that document had been in Deverell's pocket from the beginning. I need to go to London, Verity said. I need to see my father. The journey south took 4 days. Over roads only half recovered from the winter, and Adrian would not hear of her going alone, and so they went together, and Frome came with them, and his trunk of records, and they took rooms in a quiet street, and Verity sent a single line to her father, asking him to call, and Sir Hugh Calder came the next morning, hat in hand, looking older and grayer and more frightened than she had ever seen him. I knew. She saw it the moment he came through the door, the way he could not meet her eyes, the way his hands would not be still. He knew exactly why she had sent for him. She did not shout. She had learned long ago that shouting taught a man to close ranks. She sat him down, and she poured him tea he did not drink, and she told him plainly what she had found, the trust, the notice, the inflated claim, and she watched him grow smaller in his chair, and then she said, and now you will tell me about the settlement, father. You will tell me what Deverell had you do. And Sir Hugh, who had gambled away his daughter's horse and his wife's peace and his own good name, and who had at the last sold his own child to save his skin, put his face in his hands and told her. Deverell had come to him when the debts were at their worst and offered to clear them, and in exchange had asked one small favor. There was a clause in the marriage settlement, a technical matter of how a certain interest was to be assigned, and Deverell had asked him to sign it as written and to swear, if ever he were asked, that it had been read and understood and freely agreed by all parties. Sir Hugh had signed and sworn and had not read it because he never read anything, and because a man drowning in debt does not examine the rope thrown to him. He understood now what he had not then. Deverell had built a small, deliberate flaw into the very document that made the marriage a defect he could point to later to argue the whole arrangement must be unwound. And Sir Hugh's false oath was to be the proof of it. I did not know, girl, he said, and there were tears standing in his red eyes. I swear to you, I did not know he meant to use it against you. I thought it was only lawyer's business. I thought I was saving us. You were saving yourself, Verity said, not cruelly, only truly. You always were. But she looked at her father, this weak and ruined man who was for all of it still her father, and she saw that he was at last ashamed, and that shame in a man who had spent his life avoiding it was almost a kind of courage. Then here is how you will make it right, she said. Deverell wrote to you. Men like Deverell always write because they cannot resist putting their cleverness on paper. He instructed you what to sign and what to swear. Somewhere in your papers, Father, there is a letter in his hand telling you to lie, and you're going to give it to me." Sir Hugh looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded, and something in his ruined face steadied the way Adrian's had steadied over the old letters months before. He would find it, he said. He had kept it. He kept everything Deverell ever sent him out of an old instinct, the instinct of a man who has learned the hard way that the person holding your debts may one day need to be reminded of his own sins. He would bring it to her by nightfall. Hide it. He came back in the dark with a bundle of correspondence, and among it in Deverell's own sharp, confident hand was the letter, the instructions, the whole ugly design laid out in a creditor's careless certainty that a broken baronet would never dare turn on him. Verity read it once and set it down and closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the last piece had fallen into place, and the third way she had promised her husband was no longer a hope. It was a plan. The dispute over the Carrick Bay compensation came before the commission on a raw morning at the tail of a long winter in a paneled room in London that smelled of coal smoke and wet wool and the particular dust of official papers. Sir Rowland Deverell came with an eminent counsel and a serene expectation of victory, for he believed himself to hold the estate's throat in his hand, and he believed the reluctant Earl too proud or too squeamish to fight, and he had not the faintest idea what had been assembled against him in a cold study on the moors. Adrian was there, and Frome, and behind them in the seat where the law permitted her to sit, and not to speak, was Verity, dressed in dark and sober blue, her hands folded in her lap, her whole case written out in her own precise hand and laid before the counsel who would rise in her place. Deverell's counsel spoke first, and he spoke smoothly of a good and valid mortgage of a debt long owed and long unpaid of an estate that had failed for 3 years to press its own claim, and thereby he suggested confess the weakness of it. He spoke of the recent and hurried marriage, and he let his voice grow delicate as he approached the matter of the settlement, and he hinted, as Deverell had trained him to hint, that there were irregularities in that document which cast a shadow over the whole of the Earl's position, and which his client would with great regret be compelled to lay before the court in their proper time. Then it was the estate's turn, and the estate's counsel rose, and he was a plain and unhurried man, and he read from the pages Verity had written, and he built the thing exactly as she had built it, one stone laid upon the next. Hobb began with the order of notice. He laid before the commission the record of the trust established 2 years past, and the notice of that trust duly given and its date. Then he laid beside it the record of Deverell's notice of his mortgage near a full year later. And he stated without heat the plain rule that every man in that room knew to be the law, that where a chosen action is assigned to more than one party, priority follows the giving of notice, and that the trust, having given notice first, stood first in a right, and the mortgage, whatever its merits, stood second. The whole edifice of Deverell's confidence rested on a rule that pointed quietly and irrefutably the other way. Deverell's counsel rose to object, and found there was very little to object to, for the dates were the dates, and a man cannot argue with a calendar. Then the estate's counsel turned to the sum. He laid out the true figure Deverell had actually advanced, reconstructed to the shilling from the estate's own ledgers, and beside it the figure Deverell had claimed near half again, the first, and the difference was not interest and not charges, but a claim inflated in the expectation that no one would ever add up the columns. And a man who inflates his claim, counsel observed mildly, invites the court to wonder what else he has been willing to write down. That is not true. And then last he came to the settlement, and here the estate's counsel changed the temperature of the room. His client understood. He said that the opposing party meant to allege a defect in the marriage settlement, and he wished to address it directly. He laid before the court a letter. He named its author and its date, and its substance was plain, for it was a letter in Sir Rowland Deverell's own hand, instructing a certain gentleman what clause to sign and what oath to swear, so that a defect might be built into the document and exploited later. The alleged flaw, counsel said, was not one the estate had made. It was one the opposing party had designed and paid for, and now hoped to profit by, and the proof of it was in his own hand. The room was very quiet. Sir Rowland Deverell sat with his handsome face gone the color of old tallow, and he did not look at the commission, and he did not look at his own counsel, who had turned to stare at him. He looked across the width of the paneled room at the woman in dark blue who sat in the seat reserved for those the law would not let speak, and who looked back at him steadily with neither triumph nor pity, only the flat and level attention of a person reading a ledger to its last line. I understood in that moment exactly who had beaten him, and there was nothing whatever that the law would let him do about it, because she had not said a single word. The commission's finding when it came was not dramatic for such findings, never are. It was a dry recitation of dates and rules and figures, but its substance was plain. The trust, having given first notice, held the prior right to the Carrick Bay compensation. Deverell's mortgage stood second, and his claim, inflated beyond the sum advanced, was allowed only in the true amount to be satisfied out of the estate and not out of the compensation at all. The compensation itself passed clean and entire to the trust, and thence by the terms Adrian had written into it 2 years before, to the men and women of Carrick Bay and their children, and the community they had built across the sea. The letter in Deverell's hand was referred onward to a place where such letters are answered for, and Sir Rowland Deverell walked out of that room, a man whose good name was finished, and whose long climb toward a peerage had ended in a single morning in the mud. Outside, in the cold, clear light of the London street, Adrian took his wife's hand and held it as though he could not quite believe it was there. "You did it," he said. "Counsel did it," Verity said. "I merely wrote it down." She looked up at him, and the old dryness was in her voice, but the warmth beneath it was not disguised at all. "Coverture is a foolish law, Adrian. But it turns out a woman can win a battle very handily from behind a curtain if she is the one who has drawn the map. I have spent my whole life speaking through the mouths of men who did not know they were saying my words. Today, for once, I did it on purpose and for something worth the doing." He laughed, the deep, unguarded laugh she had first heard rolling down the great staircase at Frome's arrival, and he did not care who in the street saw an earl laughing like a boy. The rumors, of course, changed. They always do. Deverell, returning to London with his position in ruins, could not bear to be known as the man undone by a country wife, and so to save his face he told a different story. Not a neglected bride weeping on the moors, but a monstrous and unnatural woman who ruled Ravenhurst with an iron hand, who had bewitched her husband entirely and kept the poor earl under her cold and terrible control. And London, grown bored of pitying Verity, took up the new tale with delight, and the gossip shifted seamlessly from pity to fear. The hostesses who had once planned to save her now struck her name from their lists with a shudder, and the frantic letters from her mother stopped altogether. It was the finest gift London could possibly have given them. There was one more letter from her father some weeks later, and it was not the letter of a schemer. It was small and hesitant, and it thanked her awkwardly for letting him make one thing right at the end, and it did not ask for money, which was from Sir Hugh Calder, a kind of miracle. Verity wrote him a short reply. She told him that if he ever again found himself in want, he was welcome to apply for a place as an undergroom at Ravenhurst, though the hours were long and the horses did not suffer fools. And then, because she was her father's daughter, and not only his judge, she folded a modest and private sum inside the letter, enough to keep him in bread and out of the worst gaming houses, and said nothing of it to anyone, not even to Adrian, who found out anyway and had the sense to hold his tongue. The winter broke, and the moors turned a vivid, shocking green. And one bright afternoon the following autumn, Verity stood at the great window of the study, with her hand pressed to the small of her back, arching against the dull ache that had lately taken up permanent residence there. She was 6 months gone with child. There was nothing delicate or glowing about it, whatever the poet said. Her ankles swelled and her back ached, and she had spent a good part of the spring wretchedly ill, and she had never in her life felt more firmly rooted to the earth. Adrian came in with mud on his boots and did not care, and he crossed straight to her and read her posture in a glance. "Your back is troubling you again," he said. It was not a question. "It is merely gravity making its demands," Verity said, turning to face him. He frowned and stripped off his riding gloves and stepped behind her, and his large, warm hands pressed firmly into the base of her spine, and she let out a long, shuddering sigh and leaned back against his chest. "Better," he murmured against her ear. "Much." He kept his hands there, taking her weight. "The new roof on the far cottages is finished," he said, "and the ewes are lambing early. It'll be a good spring. Mrs. Renshaw tells me the South accounts are perfectly balanced," Verity said, closing her eyes. "We have a surplus this quarter." "Because you bargain with the grain merchants like a highwayman," Adrian said, amusement warming his voice. "They are more afraid of your ledgers than they ever were of my temper." "Good." They stood a while in a comfortable silence, watching the clouds gather over the distant peaks, and this, Verity thought, was their marriage. It had not been built on sonnets or ballroom declarations. It had been built on balanced ledgers and mended cottages and shared silences and a fierce protective wall raised together against a world that had never understood either of them. "There is news out of Parliament," Adrian said after a while quietly. "That bill, the one for the custody of children. Frome writes that it has lately passed at last." Verity opened her eyes. For months, there had been a shadow at the edge of her joy that she had never spoken aloud. A thing Deverell had once tried to use against her, that by the law as it had stood, a mother had no right at all to her own child. That if anything happened to Adrian, the child in her would be no more hers than the furniture. She had said nothing of it because there had been nothing to be done, and she did not believe in grieving over walls she could not move. But the wall had moved. Not all the way, but it had moved. "Then the world grows a little less monstrous," she said, and laid her own hand over his where it rested, one law at a time. Adrian slid his hands around to cup the swell of her, his thumbs resting gently against the linen of her gown. "Remind me," he said, "never to cross you, Countess." "See that you do," she replied. And then quite suddenly a sharp, distinct kick struck against his palm, and he went utterly still, and his breath caught, and he looked down at her belly and then up at her face with an expression of such sudden naked wonder that she nearly wept. "I is restless today," Verity said softly. "Or she," Adrian corrected his voice, "gone thick," and he dropped to his knees right there on the fine rug and pressed his face against her, his hands bracketing her hips with infinite care, and began to murmur quiet, reverent, foolish promises to a child that had not yet been born. Verity looked down at her husband, the man society had called a cold and unnatural monster, kneeling on the floor of a poor and beloved house to make vows to an unborn child. And she ran her fingers through his dark, silver-threaded hair and remembered the whispers in the London drawing rooms, the smug faces of the women who had thought she was being sent to an icy tomb. She thought of their hollow marriages and their absent husbands and their desperate need to be approved of by a society that would discard them the moment they showed a flaw. They had pitied her. Let them, she thought. Let them keep their glittering ballrooms and their poisoned tea. She had the moors. She had the stone house that never quite warmed. She had a fortune given away for the right reasons and a conscience she was proud to share. And she had the whole and undivided devotion of the Earl of Ravenhurst. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The heavy oak doors of Ravenhurst Court stood open to the summer breeze some years on, and the house was no longer a silent tomb. It rang with the sound of running feet. A boy of 4 with his mother's sharp dark eyes and his father's chaotic silver-threaded hair sprinted across the great entrance hall, clutching a wooden sword and trotting after him, badly out of breath and holding a wooden shield that looked suspiciously like the lid of one of Mrs. Renshaw's stew pots came Mr. Elias Frome. "Halt, you barbarian!" Frome panted, shoving his spectacles up his nose. "Rome does not fall to a toddler." The boy shrieked with laughter and dodged behind a suit of armor. Verity watched from the doorway of the study with a ledger balanced on her hip. She was dressed simply. The cruel whalebone of her London youth, long since abandoned for comfortable practical muslin, and she looked older, the lines of her face sharpened by responsibility, but the weary cynicism that had once defined her was entirely gone. Adrian came up behind her, smelling of horsehair and fresh pine, and wrapped his arms about her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. And together they watched their son ambush a terrified scholar of ancient documents. "From is going to let him win again," Adrian murmured. "Of course he is," Verity replied. "Frome is entirely subjugated. I believe our son now outranks him in the hierarchy of the household." Adrian chuckled, the sound rumbling deep against her back, and turned his head and pressed a lingering kiss to the curve of her neck. They stood together on the threshold of the life they had built, a life forged not in the fires of sweeping romance, but in the quiet, unyielding iron of mutual respect. They had taken the worst that the world had handed them, a cynical bargain, a cruel rumor, an exile on the edge of the moors, a fortune soaked in old wrong, and out of all of it they had built something clean and true. "Are you happy?" Verity, Adrian asked quietly. It was a question he asked her often, usually in the still moments of the evening, as though he still could not quite believe she had stayed. Verity turned her head and caught his gaze. The pale gray eyes that had once looked like winter ice were warm now and anchored and entirely hers. "I am the most terrifying countess in the north," she said, a smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "The accounts are balanced. The tenants are thriving. A good and honest debt has been paid to the people it was owed, and London is far too frightened to send us visitors." She reached up and laid her hand along his jaw. "I have everything I could possibly want." Adrian smiled and drew her back against him and buried his face in her hair, and the heavy oak door of the study clicked shut behind them, sealing away the noise of the hall. But this time it was not to hide from the world. It was only because they had at last no further need of it. They were already home,